After studying this module, you shall be able to know what interpretation of quality data means, understand the difference between description, analysis and interpretation, learn the ways and approaches of interpreting qualitative data, analyze the concerns in interpretation of qualitative data from the perspective of research philosophy, identify the ethical constraints in the interpretation of qualitative data, perceive the issues of validity in the interpretation of qualitative data. Till now, we have looked at the procedures of producing or selecting data in qualitative research. The question is, once you have collected the data and have coded it and have generated the categories, what do you do with it? After developing the categories and themes, once the coding is under progress, the researcher starts a process whereby he or she tries to offer integrative interpretations of whatever he or she has learned from the data. Interpretation is often referred to as telling the story, as it brings coherence and meaning to the categories, patterns and themes while developing linkages between them and offers a storyline that makes sense and is engaging to read. Interpretation as a purposeful activity first emerged in the culture of classical antiquity and was concerned with making sense of difficult mythical and or religious documents. Later, with the writings of Friedrich Schleiermacher and William Dilthey, it was suggested that interpretation happens whenever we try to understand spoken or written language, or indeed any human acts. Thus, interpretation is about finding meaning in any forms of human expression. Patton in 2002 notes, interpretation means attaching significance to what was found, making sense of the findings, offering explanations, drawing conclusions, extrapolating lessons, making inferences, considering meanings and otherwise imposing order. Part of this phase is concerned with evaluating the data for their usefulness and centrality. The researcher should examine all the data segments to support the emerging story, to illuminate the questions being explored and to decide how they are central to the story that is unfolding about the social phenomena. Difference between description, analysis and interpretation of data. In most of the texts dealing with research methodology, the words description, analysis and interpretation are often used interchangeably. It is important to understand the difference between them, particularly with respect to the qualitative data. Description of data simply involves giving a detailed account of something or someone in words. Interpretation goes a step further than description. It deals with attaching significance to what the data is showing you, making sensible inferences about your findings, offering context-specific explanation to the phenomena under observation, and drawing conclusion based on this entire exercise. It is also important to understand that interpretation is not the same as analysis. Willig in 2012 explains the difference by suggesting that analysis of data would basically involve systematically categorizing participants' statement into a hierarchy of themes that are then presented as findings of the study. Whereas, interpretation would enter the picture only when the links are made between the findings of the study and the relevant literature and theories in the field. This distinction has to be kept in mind while dealing with the qualitative data. Nature of interpretation in qualitative research. According to Schassman and Strauss 1973, qualitative data are exceedingly complex and not readily convertible into standard measurable units of objects seen and heard. They vary in level of abstraction, in frequency of occurrence, in relevance to central questions in the research. Also, they vary in the source or ground from which they are experienced. Our model researcher starts analyzing very early in the research process. For him, the option represents an analytic strategy. He needs to analyze as he goes along, both to adjust his observation, strategies, shifting some emphasis towards those experiences which bear upon the development of his understanding, and generally to exercise control over his emerging ideas by virtually simultaneous checking or testing of these ideas. Probably the most fundamental operation in the analysis of qualitative data is that of discovering significant classes of things, persons and events in the properties which categorize them. In this process, which continues throughout the research, the analyst gradually comes to reveal his own is and because he names classes and links one with the another, at first with simple statements, propositions that expresses the linkages, and continues this process until his proposition fall into sets in an ever increasing density of linkages. Peshkin in 2000 had addressed the process of interpretation from a research he had conducted on the academic achievements of Native American youth. This paper illuminates the relationship of the researcher's subjectivity to the many decision points that each process of interpretation had embodied in the study. The problematic discussed in this paper very appropriately describe the way in which the process of interpretation unfolds in the process of conduction of the qualitative research. He states that the interpretive journey of the researcher starts with the very naming of his or her research study. The naming point due to the relevant literature or the existing work that the researcher reviews in order to plan his or her study. Secondly, the course of a researcher's interpretation builds upon the assumption of facts that he or she incorporates into a line of reasoning. The credibility of the researcher rests on whether the others see and accept the relationship between facts obtained by the researcher and the reasoning used by him or her. The paper quotes the philosopher of science Abraham Kaplan, who has written about the researcher's need to distinguish the meaning of the act to the actor and to us as scientists. These are act meaning and action meaning. After arriving at an act meaning, the researcher must search for the meaning of the interpreted action, its interconnections with other actions or circumstances, as cited in Peshkin in 2000. Thirdly, answering the general questions that emerge in the research process depends upon the skills of inquiry of the researcher, including what specific question he or she develops to ask and how he or she asks them, as well as who he or she can locate to interview and with what depth of rapport. All researchers are not equally equipped with such skills. Moreover, the interpretation of one's researcher depends on the extent to which he or she accepts or rejects what he or she is told. Thus, a researcher dealing with qualitative data engages in the process of interpretation from the very beginning of the research process. Interpretation comprises all the elements of selection, ordering, associating, and meaning making. Therefore, interpretation of qualitative data is an act of logical reasoning and analytical ability. This is because it entails perceiving importance, order, and form in what one is learning that relates to the argument, story narrative that is continually undergoing creation. By Peshkin in 2000. How to interpret qualitative data. Interpreting the same text differently. Remember the story of Dr. Jekyll and Hyde? This text by R.L. Stevenson has generated a large number of interpretive activity, each approaching it from a different angle and asking different questions about the text. According to Willig in 2012, the fact is that very different interpretation of the same text can be generated as a result of asking different questions of and about the text suggested. That every interpretation is underpinned by an assumption that the interpreter makes about what is important and what is worth paying attention to, as well as what can be known about and through the text. Thus, our epistemological position determines the type of interpretation we generate. And hence, same or different researchers trying to study a problem or a phenomena through psychoanalytic, phenomenological, discourse analysis and psychosocial approaches to qualitative research will come up with different interpretations. For instance, for the same statement said by the respondent in an interview, interpretation using discourse analysis would concern itself with the way that he or she talks about their experience and how he or she constructs these experiences through language, both verbal and non-verbal. Whereas an interpretation using phenomenological analysis would concern itself how something is experienced and how such an experience is interpreted by the individual who is having such an experience, what it means to him or her, etc. And an interpretation using psychoanalytic approach would attempt to identify underlying psychic structures and processes that motivate the person, overt and covert behavior. Other approaches may result in similar and different interpretation of the same text. It is to be kept in mind that the selection of the approach depends on the research question and the theoretical premise of the study. An overview of the approaches to interpret qualitative data. The interpretation of the data is at the core of qualitative research, although its importance is seen differently in the various approaches. Sometimes, for example, in objective hermeneutics and conservation analysis, research refrains from using specific methods for data collection, beyond making recordings of everyday situations. In these cases, the use of research methods consists of applying methods for the interpretation of text. In other approaches, it is a secondary step following more or less refined techniques of data collection. This is the case, for example, with qualitative content analysis or with some methods of handling narrative data. In grounded theory research, example in Strauss in 1987, the interpretation of data is the core of the empirical procedure, which, however, includes explicit methods of data collection. The interpretation of text serves to develop the theory as well as the foundation for collecting additional data and for deciding which cases to select next. Therefore, the linear process of first collecting the data and later interpreting it is giving up in favor of an interwoven procedure. It has been argued by the philosophers of research that any interpretation of text may pursue two opposite goals, which are in fact strategies that can be applied successively or alternatively. One of these goals is to put the text into its context by revealing and uncovering the statements hidden in the material. This often leads to an augmentation of the given textual material, and sometimes page-long interpretations are written even for the short passages given in the original text. The other goal strives towards reducing the original text instead of augmenting it. This is usually done by paraphrasing, summarizing or categorizing the given textual data. Flick in 2009 has discussed the approaches of interpreting qualitative data in great detail. The excerpts of some of these approaches are discussed as follows. Grounded theory research. Grounded theory research uses the procedure of coding for analyzing data that have been collected in order to develop a grounded theory. This procedure was introduced by Glasser and Strauss in 1967 and further elaborated by Glasser in 1978, Strauss in 1987 and Strauss and Cobbin in 1990 and Charmas in 2006. While using this approach, the interpretation of data cannot be done independent of their sampling or collection. Interpretation is thus inherent in the entire process of conduction of the research. Inductive methodology followed in this kind of research enables the researcher to start from the data and arrive at a generalizable conclusion potent enough to be framed into a theory about the phenomena under study. Content analysis. According to Bohr in 2000, content analysis is one of the classical procedures for analyzing textual material, no matter where this material comes from, ranging from media products to interview data. One of the essential features of content analysis is the use of categories. These categories are often derived from the theoretical models, but they are repeatedly assessed against the data and, if necessary, are modified in the process. Contrary to the approaches, the goal here is to reduce the material into its simplest categories and subcategories. Mehring in 2000 and 2004 has developed a procedure for a qualitative content analysis. Narrative analysis. Narrative analysis starts from a specific sequential order. The individual statement that the researcher wishes to interpret is first considered in terms of whether it is a part of a narrative and is then analyzed. Narratives are stimulated and collected in the narrative interview in order to reconstruct biographical processes. More generally, 5 is conceptualized as narrative in order to analyze the narrative construction of reality by Brunner in 1987 and 1991, without necessarily using a procedure of data collection explicitly aimed at eliciting narratives. Conversation analysis. Conversation analysis is not much directed towards interpreting the text content like interview responses which has been produced explicitly for the research purposes. Rather than formal analysis of everyday situations is the subject matter of conversation analysis. 3 things should be kept in mind in this regard. First, conversation analysis assumes that the interaction proceeds in an orderly way and nothing in it should be regarded as random. Second, the context of interaction not only influences this interaction but also produced and reproduced in it. And third, the decision about what is relevant in social interaction and thus for the interpretation can only be made through the interpretation and not by extant settings. Discourse analysis. Discourse psychology as developed by Edwards and Potter in 1992, Hare in 1998 and Potter and Wetherell in 1998. Discourse analysis is interested in showing how in conversations, participants' conversational version of events, memories, description, formulations are constructed to do communicative interactive work by Edwards and Potter in 1992. Although conversation analysis is named as a starting point, the empirical focus is more on the content of talk, its subject matter and with its social rather than linguistic organization. This allows the analysis of psychological phenomena like memory and cognition as social and, above all, discursive phenomena. A special emphasis is on the construction of versions of the events in reports and presentations. The interpretive repertoires which are used in such constructions are analyzed. Procedure to interpret qualitative data. Now the question arises, how to interpret the qualitative data? The straightforward answer to this question is, there is no set rules or procedure. The task, according to most of the researchers, basically starts with bringing all the data together. The themes and connections should be used to explain findings. A good place to start is to develop a list of the key points or important findings one discovers as a result of sorting and categorizing the data. Further, the research question of the study should be revisited and recalled. This can be followed by trying to situate the findings in the theoretical framework selected for the study. Interpretation, therefore, basically involves attempting to put one's data into perspective. Many researchers have advocated the use of levels of interpretation in a qualitative study. This ranges from an empathetic descriptive level, where meaning is found out from the point of view of the participant, to a critical humanistic level, where an alternative narrative is built by the researcher by drawing from pre-existing theoretical perspectives. Such an exercise results in a deeper understanding of the phenomena. Therefore, it has to be kept in mind that the interpretation of qualitative data cannot happen in a step-by-step linear fashion. Rather, it involves a repetitive process of critically reading, interpreting, and reaching shared understanding of the collected data. Dealing with the qualitative data through this method of going back and forth provides the researcher with a better understanding of the phenomena under study. You must have noticed till now that the act of interpretation remains like a mysterious mission in the analysis of qualitative data. In the simplest terms, the aim of this mission is all about bringing sense to the raw data, which otherwise has little or no inherent meaning in itself. But the mystery of the mission lays in the method and the approach adopted to do so. Thus, qualitative analysis transforms data into findings. No formula exists that the transformation guidance, yes, but no recipe. The final destination remains unique for each inquirer, known only when and if arrived at, by Payton in 2002. Concerns in the interpretation of qualitative data. Philosophy of qualitative research and its influence on the interpretation of qualitative data. Qualitative research is concerned with meaning, and the objective is to describe, to understand, and sometimes also to explain. Qualitative psychology emerged from a critique of positive research and grew out on an understanding that the psychological knowledge which had been accumulated over the years was not simply a reflection of the reality or an objective assessment of how people tick, but rather than edifice of theoretical and empirical work that was grounded in a particular tradition of pre-existing knowledge and expectation, which reflected rather than challenged a basic assumption about people that circulated in society at a particular time. Such a premise rooted qualitative psychology in the idea of giving voice to those who had been excluded from the traditional psychological research. Since the very philosophy of this qualitative research challenges the existing notions, any interpretation of qualitative data should also be highly sensitive to the dangers associated with the imposition of meaning and preconceived theoretical formulation upon research participants' experience. In the studies using qualitative methodology, data analysis and data collection happen simultaneously in order to arrive at an interpretation which is coherent. The researcher initially starts with some well-established concepts and that guides his or her study. But in the course of the research, he or she modifies even these concepts as data is collected and analyzed. Thus, the overall strategy of the research is closer to the interpretive subjective end of the continuum than to the technical and objectivist end. Interpretation of qualitative data and the reflexivity of the researcher. You must be aware that in qualitative research, any communication of the researcher with the field is considered as an intervening or extraneous variable. But in qualitative research, such engagement is viewed as a part of knowledge itself. Thus, the subjectivity of the researcher and also of those being studied becomes an inherent part of the research process. Researchers' reflection on their action and observation in the field, their impressions, irritations, feelings, and so on, become data in their own right. And these form part of the interpretation and are documented in the research diaries or context protocols. Therefore, it is not only important for the researcher to be sensitive to his or her relationship with the data, it is also advisable that he or she may declare the nature of such relationship before the interpretation exercise so as to give a contextual background to the readers. Issue of validity in the interpretation of qualitative data. One of the most important skills that a qualitative researcher should possess is critical thinking. Critical thinking makes a researcher challenge and take a relook at even the things which appear to be obvious facts. Now, how do you use this ability when interpreting qualitative data? How do you affirm that the interpretation made by you would be valid? The answer to this question can be adopting an approach whereby you critically challenge the patterns in data that seem very apparent. The key lies in realizing that no interpretation is the interpretation and alternative explanation would always exist. Therefore, as a researcher, you should always try to search for other possible explanation for the same data. A qualitative study should be designed in such a manner so that it fulfills two criterions. One, it should be dependable or authentic. This means that if two researchers would assess the same process using the same set of evidences, they should arrive at the same or similar conclusions. Second, it should be credible. This means that the researcher should provide so much evidence that his or her conclusions and inferences that any independent audit of the entire research can be done if needed. Many strategies have been looked over the period of years for ways to cross-check this issue in the research. Some of these strategies are triangulation, member checking, peer debriefing, audit traits, and intercoder reliability. You will study these strategies in detail in the other modules. What you should remember at this point is that these strategies are employed by the researcher to establish dependability and credibility of a qualitative research. Ethical constraints in the interpretation of qualitative data. It is also essential to be sensitive to the ethics of interpretation in qualitative research. First of all, the research should be self-reflective and ensure that he or she has the awareness and necessary training to fully understand the relationship between data and interpretation. Responsible interpretation also requires a good understanding of the social and political context of one's research and an awareness of the possible limitation of one's interpretations. Therefore, the researcher should keep the research question in mind and should be modest about what the researcher can reveal. Should ensure that the participant's voice is not lost and should be open to alternative interpretations. Interpretation refers to finding meaning in the collected data in the light of the research question and the theoretical framework of the study. Based on the different approaches of qualitative research, the same qualitative data can be interpreted differently. The procedure to interpret qualitative data involves engaging in a cyclic series of critical reading, interpreting, and reaching shared meanings about the data. It is important to be sensitive to the voices of the underprivileged when dealing with the qualitative data and interpreting it on the basis of an established theoretical model. Ethical standards and principle of reflexivity of the researcher must be taken care of while interpreting the qualitative data.